Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the second day of the World Astrology Summit. And we're excited to have Rod Suskin back. Rod's coming to us from South Africa, and from the first time that he's presented with us, the feedback has been so positive. Largely just to get a representative view of what's going on in South Africa and South Africa's increasing role in speaking out in ways that feel very relevant in a global sense. But also, Rod, I think we've all kind of felt that you have a certain way of communicating information that is both truth-telling and hope-inspiring. And I've felt, and so did the comments from our last summit, that there's a lot to look forward to and a lot of places to find some inspiration. So it's great to have you back and looking forward to your presentation today to talk about the national unity government in South Africa. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Wade, for that lovely introduction. That was really very nice. And I'm so happy to be back here. It's so nice to be with such a diverse world full of astrologers. That's just so exciting. And although we always have that in those big conferences, Zoom has made that so possible for us nowadays. And in this kind of changed world that we're in, and one of the things, in fact, the thing I'm really going to be talking about today is this changed world that we're in because obviously my specific interest is South Africa and the South, and I've always been very interested in the strange role that this country seems to have. And as much as that sounds like, well, everyone's country, everyone thinks their own country is special, and they are. Certainly in the 20th century and hopefully or maybe into the 21st, South Africa seems to sit in the middle of all the worlds, as it always did. Colonial powers were interested in Africa and South Africa for that very reason. That's at the kind of center of all the shipping and all the colonizing and all those things they did in the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries. 20th. So, at any rate, it's still somehow always managed to be. And for those of you who grew up in the 20th century, you know how the apartheid was such a thing in the world, and it was the whole world knew about South Africa because of that very bad reason. And all of us knew in 1994, when South Africa changed, the whole world was blown away by that and knew that, and everyone in this country, South Africa, knew that something extraordinary was going on. And what happened after that was that Nelson Mandela created the first government in 1994, and eventually will lead to the present day. And South Africa now has reached the point where, after 30 years, and think about that number, after 30 years, things have changed enough that the ANC government that Nelson Mandela established in 94 is just about to fall, and it comes up with a solution to do what Mandela did, and that is to bring as many parties as want to into a coalition together. And coalition governments are nothing new, although they're not usually by invitation of anyone who wants to join. And it tries to follow the model of 1994, which was constitutional at the time and which really established South Africa, the modern state, what we here call the New South Africa, and was quite influential in the world for at least the 90s during Mandela's years. At any rate, as so this government has been formed, and it's not quite the same as every other coalition government, just the same way everything in this country is just not quite what it should be. Like what happened in 1994, where does an oppressive, a racist government step down and hand over power to their enemy, as they did in 1994? So there was always something a little bit unusual about what had happened here. And it seemed as if the current government were trying to emulate that or draw on that in 2024 to try and suggest, okay, we can go forward in a new way because they have to save their own skins. But what they end up doing is creating a South African style coalition. And the one thing for the most of us in this room who aren't South African to know is that South Africa, as fragmented and divided and the ultimate divided society has always been, and throughout the 20th century was a sun sign Gemini by all its constitutions. All of those aspects of South Africa somehow created a unity rather than a division. The world is very divided right now. I mean, you look at the scale of that division, it's like in the United States and in Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East, all of these, they're such strongly diametrically opposed forces that they are trying to wipe each other out and clearly will end up, if not taking the world down with them or their world down with them, splitting everything into two. You know, I'll never forget the great astrologer Robert Zola, who died end of 21, I think. He was my teacher. He said that as far as he saw, by 2050, America will be two countries. And he said that in, the late 90s already. So that was quite a visceral idea of this divided world that we are beginning to see unfolding in front of our very eyes. So I began to wonder the strange timing of it all. Could it be that the South African coalition again is a way to try and to show the world how we, as we say in this country, how we find each other? So this government has been made out of very opposing forces, right wing and left wing and center, all in the same government, which is not usually how coalitions work. They just go for as many of the dominants that they can get a government out of. But here, like everyone is brought in. And instead of always pulling in other directions, the South African way is that we must find each other and that you have to eventually reach resolution. You can't be opposing all the time. That emulates African culture, which in African culture, there is a chief, but then where all the elders and the chief confer, they all eventually have to agree. That's how they work. So you have to find each other. So there seems to be that instinct. But now here's the thing. In doing the research and the work for this lecture, something else actually happened. So I began to notice that, there's something else that might be going on here that might be worth talking about, that might be happening. So here we are at a conference where we normally get these very well, beautiful, presented, highly informative lectures about every little part of the world, and it's such a privilege. And I find that I have to break the mold a little bit because it seems as if there could be a kind of a future topic out of what I'm discovering along the way, but I can't just blindly go along with my topic. Wade and I discussed topics, or he asked for topics back at the time just before the American election. And it was like, well, but meanwhile, the world has changed a lot since then, and so much has happened. And South Africa has been brought into Trumpian politics as well. Lots happening there. I'm not going to go too much into that, except that clearly South Africa is finding itself in this middle of everything again. So anyway, I began to realize as I worked that it wasn't really the 224 government of national unity that I was talking about, but that it seemed as if I was actually still talking about 1994, the new South Africa, Nelson Mandela's South Africa, like I was talking about, and that it wasn't so much to talk about the coalition, because like what I just told you about African culture is a good place to start. We don't even need astrology on top of that. Find each other is the only way forward, not right, I'm right, you're wrong, which is always how division really works. And I began to wonder what changed in 1994, thinking about, for example, South Africa is the first country who really stands up against what's happening in Gaza and goes to the International Court of Justice and stands up for it. And that is part of also the especially ANC and South African ethos about how you have to fight for other liberation movements as well, which is great. There they find themselves standing up. And I began to think maybe South Africa represents something in this world because this world that we're in now is a lot more intensely divided than maybe we even expected if we weren't thinking about Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, which we should have been, and we were. But if you weren't, then it's a lot more intense and divided, and I used the word oppressive there, than maybe we expected. So, nevertheless, it needs a bigger tool. And I'm looking around the world and thinking, where is the opposition and the revolution going to come from against this very oppressive form of world, which is not new, that we're finding ourselves in? And is it South Africa? So that's what I'm like investigating. I began to look at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is, beyond the government of national unity, who I will get back to. And began to as okay, so it is very much that world, at least as a start, that we're living in, by which I mean, you know, COVID started the latest version of this world. Before that, I mean, World Trade Center started the 21st century version of the world we didn't expect. But certainly post 2020, everything else is different as well. And so Saturn Pluto, of course, was the conjunction. We're going to look at that. I'm going to look at major cycles in what we're talking about today. Just to give you some illustrative words about it, Richard Tarnas's amazing book, Cosmos and Psyche, where he talks about all the great cycles of the outer planets. And these are just some of the many words he uses to describe Saturn Pluto: conservative, reactionary, um, traditional values, and so on. But also in green at the bottom of there, exceptional courage and acts of will in the face of extreme danger, hardship, death, moral darkness. Something that rises up against the moral darkness, etc., comes from the same source as it itself, Saturn Pluto, at least in astrological language. So, this world that we live in, which is being shaped by Saturn and Pluto at the moment. Now, all these major outer cycles, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, all of which I mention and that we all talk about, they're very important in showing how social and political cycles work. But we tend to only look at the exact conjunction square opposition, which is legitimate. That's looking at the equinoxes and solstices as the beginnings of the seasons. But the seasons still exist. It's not Saturn Pluto only happens boom while the conjunction is there and then goes away and reemerges at the square. These are cycles that we're talking about seasons. We're in a season. There's always a season of all of them. Which one are we in? So as you'll see, Atarnas uses very wide orbs, 15-degree orbs for these outer planet cycles. And we're basically doing the same because history doesn't switch on and off at an equinox. It slowly comes on, things change, and slowly leads to the next thing. So there's always some form of Saturn Pluto going on, in any of them. And we just look at those major conjunctions, squares, and oppositions to see the critical moments in history that bring the turning points. And when we look at the Saturn Pluto, just to extract some of what the Saturn Pluto is all about, we see a lot of the difficult events that shape the world we know. If we even just use the very basic idea of the First and Second World War. First and Second World War is the huge, big defining events of the 20th century that give forth all the other things as well. So, the birth of the modern world, the arms race, the Cold War, all of these things. And of course, the original financial crisis, 1929-30, and the rise of fascism from the beginning of the 30s. All of these, you can see, these dates in purple are the dates of the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, beyond their exactness, using the orbs. And these here are also these squares and oppositions. So the First World War occurs during the first one. The Cold War starts in the second one. Importantly, apartheid is born at that time. The State of Israel is born at that time. And, says Donald Trump, I mean, would you have it? And then we have the Reagan-Thatcher era, the HIV/AIDS era. 1980 changes the world forever, beginning of that. And the new conservatism that arises very, very strongly at that time. And its squares and oppositions, square including the birth of the new South Africa, opposition, the World Trade Center, the defining event for the 21st century that kicks it off in that way. And then the current Saturn square opposition, which was in 2020, that brings the COVID era, the January the 6th storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., a defining moment in modern American history, and the beginning of Russia's preparations to invade Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine had been in a war since 2014. It's only in 2021 that Russia suddenly starts amassing on their border and saying we're not going in while going in. just like, happened in Poland in 1939. So these very big events, we can see how they shape the kind of the real politic and the geopolitic of the world that we find ourselves in and dealing with effects and consequences of that all the time. So these are the peak events, but when we look at oppression, restriction, conservatism, reactionaryism in the world, this is the background for our contemporary world that we are looking at all the time. So, just mentioned in there was the birth of apartheid. That's my first chart I want to show you. And we're just going to use charts as these bouncing points for these new ideas I'm thinking about. As I said, I'm going beyond what I wanted to talk about today because I didn't want to force everything to fit that. I really wanted to reveal what I was actually discovering along the way. So here you can see the conjunction beginning its last phase. It's still very much in orb for these big cyclical measurements. And there it sits, the apartheid. This is when the apartheid government, 4th of June 48, came into power. And so it's there. It's worth noting that kind of degree around um, Leo over there as well. And it's essentially a strong chart, strong ruler of the chart, but interestingly, it's got the Gemini sun that all the constitutions up until the recent one of South Africa had. Until then, there was unions and there were all other amalgamations of this country that always were in Gemini territory. But there's the conjunction. I just wanted to show you a chart of it. And there is the chart of the announcement of the end of apartheid around it. The announcement of the end of apartheid happened in February 1990 when the then president of the country stood up in parliament, unbanned the ANC, released Nelson Mandela, did all of those things which brought a shock end. No one saw it coming. Shock end to apartheid and the beginning of the negotiations that would slowly lead to the birth of the new South Africa 4 years later. Some of you might remember that period was quite a significant period of change in the world, that end of apartheid era, I should say. 1989, November 1989, was the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Lynn Bell will be talking about that conjunction in her lecture later today. It's fascinating. That lecture is sure to be amazing. You must really attend that. And the Saturn Neptune is a very fascinating conjunction, as Lynn describes very well, how it brings these ideological changes and the dissolving of old structures. November 89, Saturn Neptune were conjunct. In that week, the Berlin Wall began to fall. Uh, Russia, the Soviet Union began to fall, and the presidency changed from the previous president, Botha, of this country, to de Klerk, the guy who would then release Nelson Mandela a few weeks later. So that was a great turning point, that Saturn Neptune, that you can see over here now separating a little bit later. This is February of 1990. But notice in February of 1990, end of apartheid, how Pluto is exactly squaring that Saturn, squaring that conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. Uh, I mean, I'll mention that the node is sitting there emphasizing it all, but that's the south node which destroys. So it's quite a vivid description of the destruction of apartheid by its final son, the last of the Afrikaans leaders, who brings this destruction to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and suggests, yes, we had the oppression of Saturn-Pluto in 1948, but here in 1990, Pluto's destructive role seems to represent something else, seems to represent destroying repression itself. And that's the sudden difference that begins to glimmer in the South African chart. Here is the South African chart. This is the chart of the so-called New South Africa that was then finally formed after 2 solid years of negotiation, 92 through 94. that led to a new constitution, flag, national anthem, coat of arms, everything changed at that time. So, for the Wade caves among us, I'll just point out that the midnight birth time of this chart, because I know, Wade, you're a midnight skeptic, the midnight birth time of this chart is constitutional. So we actually did definitely start the constitution at that time. And in fact, because it was such a momentous change, and we were all witnessing it. Everyone was watching the TV, watching from Pretoria, the old flag being lowered and the new flag being raised. And that's why I've got 30 seconds there, because I was watching. And 30 seconds up, the new flag was up, and the symbols and everything had completely changed. So our esteemed Dr. Nicholas Campion, who spoke yesterday, pointed out in his brilliant book, The Book of World Horoscopes, that, and in conversation with me, that what constitutes a new chart is change of constitution and symbols of state all at the same time. That's all that happened at exactly that moment. So there's the chart of the new South Africa. And striking about it is two things. Saturn, Pluto, our friends, are here in uh, kind of just coming out of their square. So that square was in 92. So they're just coming out of it, but they are Pluto in the angle, has Pluto in the angle, and Pluto suggesting in the 10th house some kind of powerful effect in the world. But most interesting of all is, of course, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, which has been happening for a little while by then. And here are just some words that, again, Tarnas uses to describe the nature of that cycle in social and political change. So, born hiding in the 12th house, but also emblematic of what South Africa was. It was this overthrow of apartheid that was without any war and without the usual ways that governments change. I won't say without bloodshed, because, of course, masses of that had happened in the many years of apartheid leading up to that. But that Uranus, Neptune in the house of insurrection, which is really what that is, where you would find that. So there is the potential for influencing the world through the 10th house. There's the Uranus Neptune. This is Nelson Mandela's coalition government chart, because the new constitution put that government into place at that hour. So that is really the chart that seems to resonate to this very day. And the interesting thing, in this country at the time, we all knew something extraordinary was happening, and you could literally feel it. There was this, you could feel the social temperature. You could feel the shift happen when, the symbols change, and suddenly everyone loved the new flag. And there was definitely a feeling in the air that felt like something is walking in the land. There's a reason why what's going on is going on. Now, again, it's not the only social revolution or political revolution that happens in the world, and they all are very big, and they're much bigger ones than that. But for the people in the land, it felt that there's something bigger to this. And so Saturn, Pluto, Pluto being angular there, Uranus, Neptune, I'm wondering, are they becoming some kind of a theme? Are they now, what's happened here is this revolution against apartheid. Do Pluto and Saturn mean something different, mean perhaps the standing up against moral darkness bit that Tarnas mentioned earlier on? So here's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Now, what I actually did, and I did this by experimentation, this isn't a chart for the exact moment, which computers give us the fantastic ability to do. And that's still a very important moment, sure. But in astrology, we generally consider something like exact from its partile conjunction. And so this is the partile conjunction. And by experimentation, using orb, partile, and exact, I discovered in most of what I was looking at, partile seemed to work the best. And that's not surprising, because astrology would expect that. So I drew this chart instead for the partile conjunction, and I drew it at Cape Town. And at Cape Town, this conjunction of the 6th of January 2020 is rising with the sun and like everything else. But it's very much in the first house, very powerfully in this huge Capricorn stellium of again, suggesting either this country will immediately become an authoritarian regime or it's going to be emblematic of Saturn Pluto in some perhaps form, or perhaps some form, I should say. So it seems to initiate the new cycle, though, in the rest of the world of authoritarianism, fascism, war, all of those things. And many of these things all really still very much resonant in the world today. So it's a very potent chart, actually between two eclipses, you might notice as well. So is this the victory of Saturn Pluto, or is it the somehow the flip that South Africa flips to the other side and tries to be a light in moral darkness? Again, I'm not suggesting South Africa is this lovely, perfect place where everything is very moral because it's as corrupt as the best of them, but it's in a very ordinary way, not the way that tears apart the country and creates a war. So in all of that, we still try and find our moral compass that Mandela and this era suggested that maybe we're supposed to do. And so it's an interesting point in the whole South African drama that Saturn Pluto becomes very focal from 2020 onwards. Um, so this new cycle, South Africa, it's also going to lead to South Africa's split. I mean, South Africa's first split in government, and that creates this coalition government a few years later. This is the period it'll happen under. So here is that chart around the South African chart. That is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction around the South African chart. And you can see, again, still keeping with these wider orbs that these large cycles have. We're not looking at triggers of exact transits. But notice here how the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is creeping up on the Uranus-Neptune one. It's very close within orb of, especially if he's allowing huge orbs of 15 degrees, but even beyond what Thomas says, just seeing it as that slow natural cycle. These are very much hitting the Uranus Neptune 12th house suggestion of this revolutionary change of vision that perhaps is now activated. That's always sat there in South Africa's chart since 1994, but in 2020 becomes activated in some way. So that's my question, and that's what I'm beginning to discover by looking at these charts. That was what I was noticing by looking at these charts. So then let's skip forward a couple of years to 2024. I just want to quickly show you the South African, the signing of the agreement that created that coalition government, the current one. It's not the actual beginning of that government, which is a few weeks later, but it's the moment that they finally reached agreement, which was televised live and the whole country was waiting and it was all of that. So that's the very redolent moment that is captured over here, probably in that Gemini stellium in the 11th house over there. Very, very much about that negotiation and resolution of it that happened at that time. So somehow embodying all these opposites in some way. So look at the Uranus in the 10th. It's very different, unusual government. The Pluto in the 7th, which is the house of foreign affairs for national charts. So Pluto is suggests maybe the kind of conflict we're having with America right now. It's where Trump has severely criticized South Africa, withdrawn all aid, including for HIV/AIDS, to the tune of billions of dollars, and have they kicked out the South African ambassador who clearly opened his mouth a bit too wide and said what he shouldn't have. But so everything went to the extreme. That's the kind of thing we would expect for Pluto in the 7th house. So it suggests again that this government has a conflict with the world and yet has this Uranus in the 10th that says we're just going to just do our thing and see what happens. So when we put that around the South African chart, just one or two things to notice that South Africa has just had the Saturn return. And that's when I said that 30 years can raise an eye because you realize that we've just had a Saturn return here. The previous Saturn return in South Africa was 1990. And 1990, as I showed you, the 2nd of February 1990 was when the end of apartheid was announced. That was exactly at South Africa's second return to the Republic of South Africa, which was formed in 1961. So its Saturn return was in 1990. The 1994 Republic, the new South Africa that we have here, had its Saturn return, of course, in 2023, leading up to the current election into 24, leading up to the current election that led to this new government. So it's a great, perfect picture of a Saturn return, Liz. So yeah, it's very much that kind of stepping into its role as an adult in the world. Whatever may be going on here is besides the point. Adults have their problems, but having to step up and say, well, if we're going to call ourselves a nation now, this is actually what we want to be. So we have to stand up against the forces of Trumpianism or whatever might be going on in Russia, Middle East, taking sides and doing none of that and trying to actually step into our own feet and say, this is our Saturn return. This is us. So we can see that that's been activated recently as well. But notice here, the Uranus at the time that the agreement is signed is opposite Pluto in South Africa. And Uranus Pluto is the force of revolution, as described in Tarnas's work as well. So that's the force that creates a revolution from the French Revolution and American revolutions of the end of the 18th century to the social revolution of the mid-late 60s, all under Uranus Pluto. So there you can see the Uranus striking South Africa's Pluto and suggesting there's a revolution going on. This might not be an obvious revolution, but what's happening in this government is revolutionary. And again, we do find that while there are right and left forces in the government who disagree about everything, including what's happening with Trump and you name it, their process has to be to find each other. That's how they work in this country. They have to find each other. And until they all agree, not until just the majority does. It's the natural African way, how African consultation democracy, shall I call it, seems to work or tries to work. So again, there is a revolution going on. It is something a little bit perhaps bigger than it looks like, but may very well offer, maybe we have something to offer the world. I mean, what else does the world have right now? Except everything is very, very polarized, and there's very, very little leadership or guidance or whatever from anyone to say, this is the right way to follow. Even if you think about during the Second World War, there were people shouting out but human nature is that maybe we don't do that. Maybe that's not the point. But eventually someone has to stand up. And will it happen? So where it happens is when South Africa stands up and takes the uh, genocide in Gaza to the International Court of Justice and says someone has to stand up. It was Nelson Mandela who said, South Africa is not free until Palestine is free. So it's not surprising that that was the choice of the ANC government. They felt a moral obligation. Plus, politically, of course, they tried to, go into um, the politics of it and get their regional followers to see that's what they have to do. But whatever might have motivated them, even if it was the most avaricious of politics, it still doesn't matter. Someone had to stand up and someone stood up. If you have a look at the force of how influence works in the world and psychological influence, political influence, whatever, you often find very small countries give to very big countries when there's a natural disaster. And that's how we all set up in our human way, these bonds of interdependence at a national scale. So whatever brings us to the point, the fact is that we did. And so this is when the case is filed. The case is presented a few weeks later, but this is when South Africa filed it. And the important thing here, of course, Saturn and Pluto in the first house. They're no longer in their conjunction. We're not growing. It's the spring of the Saturn-Pluto cycle. Saturn is beginning to move away from Pluto, We saw its dramatic effects of 2020 and everything that's happened since then. But it reaches a point where the perhaps oppressive force, but no, maybe trying to shine a light into a moral darkness force of Saturn Pluto is suddenly evident. And South Africa stands up, the country that has this Saturn Pluto relationship through apartheid and its demise. And believe me, how this country was, as many of you know, before 1994 was very Saturn Pluto. Very much for the oppressed people in this country, it was extreme. It wasn't just a denial of voting rights, whatever. It was extreme. It was very Saturn Pluto. People were detained without trial. People were killed. People lived under the harshest of conditions. It was all very Saturn Pluto. And now it's like we're taking that same Saturn Pluto that seems to be our birthright and somehow trying to turn it on its head. So for me, maybe looking at this, when I ask myself the question, so what was Nelson Mandela doing on this planet? Maybe one of the things that he was doing for us was to take that force, which is the force that, as we've seen by looking at that span of the 20th century, drives so much of what happens on this world in the worst way, and try and find a way to turn it the other way around. And so we're standing up and saying, as Saturn Pluto, we can't yield. We won't yield. We can't yield to America. We won't take sides in Russia, Ukraine, and so we don't. We don't take sides. We actually are very good friends of both Russia and Ukraine, and won't say who's right or wrong. And and as I said, Gaza, we've made ourselves clear. So will stand on that Saturn Pluto. Maybe that's what Nelson Mandela gives us and says maybe there is a way to be a light in the moral darkness. So the next square that comes around, um, which is in 2028, is the this again drawn as the Parthouse Square, and drawing it here. So this is when the current events are going to reach a culmination, obviously, in so many ways, in so many places around the world. Saturn um, conjunction Pluto 2020 culminates at the first square, then at 2028, not culminates, reaches its next power point, 2028. So looking at this chart, this is when it goes partile. This is drawn for Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, where we draw our national charts for. And again, Saturn, Pluto are angular. This is the angular position of that square when drawn at Pretoria. So putting it forward, just like happened at ICJ, um, and maybe again having to put moral courage on the table because what's happening in the world in 2028? We don't know, but none of us would be surprised if it was something like World War III. We know the world can easily go that way now. We can see, and I'm not going to talk about it because others will, and we're not here to talk about the parallels between now and the lead up to the previous two world wars. So we can see that, and we can see Saturn Pluto's involvement in both of them. So if there's going to be a war, best guess is this is when it finally cracks. Or does South Africa stand up? Is there some other shift? Just to mention, it was a South African who established the idea for the League of Nations. That was Jan Smuts, which was the predecessor to the forerunner to the United Nations. And he created its, constitution and all of that kind of stuff. Just saying. But the point is, I mean, best case scenario, could we maybe help avoid a war? I don't know. Probably not, but I don't know. Considering our relationship with all these countries, maybe we find ourselves in this situation where it happens through us, but whatever it is, or maybe there isn't war, but the negotiations happen through South Africa. I don't know. As I said, this is a speculative. I've discovered along the way that in 94, South Africa, in 1990, South Africa flips the Saturn-Pluto conjunction to its other side, moral courage, which is a legitimate expression of it, and and starts using that. And in all the critical situations of Saturn-Pluto, South Africa has it angular whenever it rocks around and makes us step up. As an angular first house Saturn is stepping up into your, I would say it as stepping into your boots. Like it or not, when Saturn's in the first house, you've got to say, this is me, here I am, standing in my boots, take it or leave it. I, the buck stops here, as a previous American president said. This is where I'm the responsible one. So that's that Saturn that keeps on being in the first house in all these charts you've seen here tonight. This morning, I should say. And well, morning, noon, and night. And here we are. When we take this upcoming square and put it around South Africa's chart, we find Pluto is sitting on the ascendant to a degree, and Saturn is sitting on the Sun to 1.5 degrees. Both are angular, Saturn and Pluto on South Africa's angles and on South Africa's Sun, suggesting not only in the Saturn-Pluto square itself is there potential role for South Africa to show some kind of moral leadership, but even when putting it around South Africa's chart, to perhaps do the same. If we didn't know or in other circumstances, we would interpret these Pluto Saturn things as very scary and say South Africa is becoming an authoritarian regime. But unlike elsewhere in the world, that is not at all what's going on in this country. Very much the opposite is happening. And so that's what, and instead of being dominated by one party as we have been for 30 years, suddenly there's this sharing that they were forced to do, but it makes a very big difference to this country. People living in this country know that it's working very much better as a government than the one of the last 30 years because they have to eventually find each other. And on most things they do. And like so far, they muddle their way through that and it works. So, hey, but it seems to, given its meaning so far, seems to have quite a promising future. I'm not suggesting a fait accompli over here, that this is what it is. I don't know. As I said, I started uncovering that as I researched for this lecture here today. So what you're seeing is very fresh thought that hopefully gives you some thoughts or some inspirations about what you're seeing in the charts that you're looking at, the national charts and the ensuing charts that you look at, even if they're not national charts. And just thinking about how the world that we are living in, dominated by Saturn, Pluto, but where is Uranus, Neptune? Where is Uranus, Pluto? They're always in part of their own cycle. But looking at the Saturn, Pluto, which is terrifying us all in the world we find ourselves in, hopefully there's a glimmer of hope for the Saturn-Pluto relationship world that we're finding ourselves in, and that even if it doesn't come through South Africa, of course, I'll be happy, as will we all. But maybe we can all look at Saturn Pluto, whether it comes through South Africa or where else it's angular in the world. And there is actually a light in all the darkness coming from the very same source. And isn't that how our universe actually works? Doesn't astrology teach us that? So those are my thoughts, folks. I hope you found them interesting or maybe some interesting thoughts and ideas for you. Um, Otherwise, let's just keep our fingers crossed if that's not the case.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rod. There's a couple of
Thanks.
comments on your material in the chat, so make sure you spend some time with that. From Cindy and Liz, I can see some contribution here. And quite a lot of very positive comments coming in as well. I think those who have just attended your presentation and those watching on the recording will, if this is your first time seeing Rod, know what I mean now when I say that there's a spirit. There's a very optimism what is the word I'm looking for? It's like there's a bit of optimism about the human condition and where we could go from here. And I to be honest with you, Rod, most of the world, it's very easy to get angry these days with the
Mm,
headlines that are coming across, and it's just so helpful and thought-provoking to be hearing ideas that are more measured and talking about ways to find paths forward with some calmness, which is much appreciated.
that's
Thank you
great.
so
Thanks
much,
so much.
Rod. It's been, really lovely having you and welcoming you to the conference, and very grateful for your time here.
Thanks so much, Ray. It's been great to be here. Still here. Thank you.